Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Albandian. I am the owner and coordinator for NORWAC, the Northwest Astrological Conference. We're moving into our 37th year of producing astrology conferences. And the dates for the conference this year are May 27th through 31st. You can find everything you need on the conference, including registration, at norwac.net. That's www.norwac.net. Pretty simple to find it. And today I'm with Chris Brennan, who is doing a lecture at NORWAC. And I was going to look back, Chris, before I tell, I'm sure most people know who you are, but I'll read a brief bio for you. But I was going to look back and see when your first lecture was. Was it in the 90s?
No, I was like 10 in the 90s. I actually, my
Were you
first,
10 in the 90s?
yeah,
That's right.
I was
That's
born in
right. You were.
84. So, um,
That's right. You're.
oh yeah, well, 84 was also the first year there was a NORWAC, I believe.
That's
So
right.
I was born a few months later.
Yes.
So my first NORWAC was actually 2005 when I volunteered to
I knew
help set up
there
the
was.
bookstore. And then I believe you invited me and my friend Nick Diggin-Best to give talks the next year in 2006.
Great. See, I aged you and I didn't need to.
That's fine. I'm fine with that.
So let me tell you a little bit about Chris. He's a professional astrologer from Denver, Colorado. He is the former president of AYA, the Association of Young Astrologers, and former research director for NCGR, the National Council for Geocosmic Research. He specializes in ancient astrology and is the host of the widely popular and well-known The Astrology Podcast. And he's the author of the book Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune. Thanks for taking the time to be with me today, Chris. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm really excited about this conference. The last one was so wildly successful last year in your first online conference that I'm excited to see the follow-up this year.
Well, I guess we'll see how that goes. We're very excited. And luckily, I mean, it isn't luck. I mean, we put a lot of hard work into it last year. We converted the conference within a 6-week window to go from an in-person conference to an online virtual conference. And now that we have that under our belt, we're, I think, a little less stressed about the whole thing, about how to produce and put this thing together. So I think it'll go solidly well.
Yeah, second time is always a little bit easier than the first time, so that's definitely a plus that you have going for you.
Unless, of course, it was just dumb beginner's luck.
Right. I mean, there was probably, to be fair, like a fair bit of luck, but also a lot of hard work, as you said.
Yes, I had Jupiter transiting my sun. I think luck had a bit, was favored on my side at the time. So you're doing a lecture called Exploring the Ancient Conceptualization of Malefics. And I find that interesting, the way you framed that. So you're exploring the conceptualization of malefics. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, there's just some like stray statements about Mars and Saturn, the planets Mars and Saturn, and some of the ancient authors like Antiochus of Athens from the first century, where Antiochus makes this statement at one point that that Saturn and the malefics in general will, when they're well placed in the chart, indicate benefits and things that increase for the native, but sometimes at the expense of other people. And I thought that was a really interesting statement, and it kind of hides or it implies a much more interesting and nuanced conception than we're used to thinking that ancient astrologers might have had about some of those planetary distinctions. And I wanted to explore that a little bit and talk about what some of those nuances look like.
Great. And want to give us a little sneak preview of that? Don't want to give too much away, but a little sneak preview of what a nuance might be beyond what you've articulated.
Yeah, well, one of the things I think that ancient astrologers actually then surprisingly share in common with modern astrologers is one, that the quote unquote malefic planets are not always malefic, but they can have constructive significations and outcomes and indicate positive things. But the other thing that's a little bit more interesting for me about how ancient astrologers deal with the supposed malefic planets is that sometimes it can indicate difficult things, but sometimes it's difficult things that are either in the person's environment or are within their control, where they're sort of manifesting it as part of their free will in a constructive fashion. So, for example, somebody might have a difficult placement in, let's say, the sixth house, which is traditionally associated with illness or with health. But they would be like a doctor or somebody that works as part of like a crisis unit, and therefore they're working to try to help sick people, which is, in a difficult context because other people are genuinely suffering, but it's not necessarily something where the native themselves is the one that's on the receiving end of that, but instead they're trying to do something positive for other people who are in a difficult circumstance.
Right. Remind me, and I know we've had this discussion before, what house system do you use for looking at natal charts?
So I primarily use whole sign houses, but I also like to, and I've been trying to explore more and more overlaying, Placidus and other quadrant house systems like Porphyry on top of that as a secondary overlay, because it seems like that was where the ancient astrologers were headed at one point before whole sign houses were forgotten about completely. And I did this episode on Noel Till last summer where was really vivid, like how the ruler of his ascendant, which was his moon, was in both like the second house and the third house. Because when he first learned about astrology, he wrote in a bio that he remarked to his wife, he said, I'm going to write a bunch of books about this and I'm going to make $1 million. And it was funny because his ruler of the ascendant, the moon, was placed in the second whole sign house, but in the third quadrant house. And you can kind of see an overlap between like the financial motivation as well as the, like, he wrote a lot of books motivation in the end.
Wrote a whole lot of books.
Yeah, he has to be one of the most prolific authors of the 20th century.
Unquestionably. Anything else you want to share with us before we wrap ourselves up here?
No, just that I'm excited about doing an online conference again. And even though we don't get to meet up in person, I felt like it was a lot more intimate and there was a lot more connection and learning that went on last year than I think anybody expected. So I'm looking forward to seeing that grow and expand even further this year and seeing some of the connections that are built at this NORWAC. And then eventually we'll see what happens when we translate that back into maybe meeting up in person in future years.
Well, we are scheduled for an in-person conference for May of 2022, 23, and 24. So I have those contracts signed. So we are fully intent on getting back to an in-person conference because that's really what we're about. And I think that we did everything intentionally for the virtual conference this last year to bring that sense of intimacy, connection, that we normally have at NORWAC, we brought to the virtual environment. And I think I think it worked, and we got a lot of feedback that it did. And I think that's because we bought into it. We brought it there, and then people bought into that as well. Instead of buying into that, they're quite literally physically in their own environment, not connected to anybody else, but because we brought that energy, everybody bought in. A lot of people bought into, I can't say that everybody did, but I know a significant portion of people joined into that environment in that way and really, really brought it home. And so I couldn't have been, quite literally, couldn't have been more pleased with the outcome of last year than I was. So thank you for bringing that up. And thank you for taking the time out of your very busy schedule